It's a pleasure to be here in Vienna at ECVA, and I'm so grateful to James and to Roland and his amazing team for pulling all of this together for a movement which is clearly growing every year. So lovely to be here. I'm going to talk about education for human flourishing in an AI world. And it did begin 6 or 7 years ago with a group of high-performing countries who, as somebody said, were already doing brilliantly well in PISA, but boldly thought, are we any longer focusing on the right things in the famous PISA test? Could it be that we're just top of the wrong game these days? And we spent 6 years thinking that through and realized what we really wanted to talk about was the purposes of education, deep now into the 21st century. We've done it through policy dialogues, bringing the permanent secretaries, the most senior education officials from these 7 jurisdictions, from Australia to the United Kingdom, via those wonderful systems in the middle, bringing them to policy dialogues to think together about where education needs to go. And it's been an amazing experience to see their thinking really evolve and mature, become more open to risk, perhaps as they, like the rest of us, saw so many of the things that we care about in our world beginning to tumble month by month. And it's been my task to kind of help them through that process. Well, I don't know how many of you have ever got an email from Andreas Schleicher. I have a special box in my emails. It's very full, and often to start the day, I just look at some of my favorite ones, but he always puts underneath his signature something like, no data, no opinion. If you don't have data, you don't deserve an opinion. I don't. Well, I'm quite interested in data like the rest of you, but I don't adduce amazing bar charts to justify my arguments. I just offer you the arguments. So be warned, if you're looking for more charts, you've seen all the charts. That's not where we're going over the next 20 minutes. See what I mean? So we began by thinking about the purposes for education that we've got, often called the human capital theory of education, and kind of codified, again, by Goldin and Katz, to go back to those writers to whom Andreas referred, thinking about the post-war international framework and how American policymakers said, what we need from education is enough people, sufficiently technocratic, to take on the latest technological developments and apply them by creating wealth. I mean, they said it slightly sotto voce, but that's what they meant. And in many ways, the last 30 or 40 years of public policy in education has been making that happen by pushing on the foundational literacies of maths, science, and reading, trying to close equity gaps, and expanding reach into higher education. And where are we at the end of it? Well, you could argue that we've hit some problems. We are sorting young people by cognitive examination for jobs in yesterday's economy, the economy that brought us wealth gaps, resource depletion, social fragmentation. So education in the service of economy, but what economy? Andreas has talked to you about the contribution that has made to our crisis of mental health, which sits all around us in country after country. And if you look ahead and think about the challenges that we face of regenerative economies, participative democracies, and on to culture and consciousness, as some would say, are we really developing a generation of young people who can help build all of that? So some things that have gone wrong with the way we have done it so far. And therefore, an education system for the future might arguably want to put those things right. principles, it might want to offer to young people new ways of seeing, sensing, interpreting the world, helping them reconcile conflicting worldviews, rebuilding meaning. Certainly an education that doesn't only reward the cognitive, but, for example, the creative, the compassionate. And, yeah, an education that does equip a generation to remake our broken economies, societies, and organizations. Those are the principles we might look for. And the argument of those 7 jurisdictions who've done so well in maths and science and reading is that an education for human flourishing system would be the system that addresses those principles. So what do we think of, we mean by human flourishing? It's bold to put up the abstract nouns, but we have talked about a system which enables young people to build their happiness, their friendship, their relationships, sense of meaning, and accomplishment, however you define that accomplishment. And from there, with more than a little help from Christensen, we've developed a way of conceptualizing education for human flourishing that would be the system that equips people for those 4 things. This is a tightly drafted descriptive statement, and each of its components are worth dwelling on. Not much time, but an education that prepares people for activities that are moral, reason-infused and emotionally driven, that means something to the person and have some consequence in the world. An education that encourages contemplation, and this is perhaps neo-Aristotelian rather than Aristotelian, inspires awe, wonder, enchantment. So that's our kind of framing of education for human flourishing. We've had to think, because everybody has, about the relationship between student well-being and education for human flourishing. Both vital, compatible, but the one perhaps more about the process of education, the school, the college you're in now, the other more about the objectives of a life, even seen looking backwards from the end of that life, and objectively. Were you happy? Did you build those relationships? Meaning, accomplishment. And for anyone who thinks that Aristotle was overly focused, and it might be unfair, on the individual, then Christian himself helped us build out those links to other traditions, Confucianism, Buddhism, Ubuntu, which underline the importance of caring for not only the self, but about others. And in a way, the crisis of the planet extends those obligations to think about other living species, but also to think about all the people who will live their lives beyond us, if only we don't ruin the planet before they get there. So those are those 3 kind of framings of education for human flourishing in an AI world. And the group of countries asked Australia if they would have a think about, big topic, what AI means in terms of possibilities, but also threats for the individual, for the economy and the society. And in many ways, that piece of work has helped us towards a set of competencies, and I'll come to it in a moment, which are partly shaped by the scariness, in particular of general AI, but also of the narrow AI we have today. So in a way, it's an AI which poses a question about what it means to be human. You might never have to fill your fridge again or fill in your own diary. But as the robots come into the very center of your life, is your self-worth, your identity, your meaning undermined? large data could help us with those things we care about, social mobility, reduced inequality. But look at what we're seeing in our world. Misuse of power, surveillance, interference in democracy, crime, and a profoundly undermined media. So there's a question about the very safety of human society in the face of AI. And then agency, this third concept. Clearly, AI will create that more productive economy that people crave again, but at what cost to workers who, at the very least, will have to rethink what they do, and it may well be that we will require far, far fewer people to do the work than once we did. So we've been thinking then about an education which better equips people for those challenges to the things that matter, their meaning, their agency, their safety. And that's just narrow AI, but we've also thought through general purpose AI and superintelligence. And what would it be like if, as some people say, the robots really do take over, decide what challenges they will address, not just the ones we give them to solve, but the ones they want to address. And there are some, like Bostrom, who would talk about the danger of humans really being put to the service of the robots, enslaved. But what if we deployed education for human flourishing to control the evolution of AI and didn't let those things happen, in which case we might once again be on track for a civilizational trajectory that leads to the compassionate and jubilant use of humanity's cosmic endowment. All of which takes me to something a bit more recognizable to educators. What then might young people seek to learn? What competencies to nurture? And after huge debate amongst that group of jurisdictions, we've settled on this quintet. The one that's slightly higher than the others is there for a reason. We have seen it as vital. Acting in the world. Slightly different from being in the world, and some would say that we don't do enough being these days, we do too much acting. But we've put the weight on acting. The ability of a young person to develop purpose, intent, and to pursue the activities that support that purpose and intent. But only when buttressed by top left, top right, adaptive problem solving, that ability to reflect on every problem you ever solved and transfer what you learnt by doing that, your knowledge, your skills, into the latest problem, and ethical competence, which has not been at the centre of many countries' education work, though there are some heroic exceptions. I think of the work that's been done for this project by Estonia. But this is about ethical recognition. Can you see the problem in its ethical dimensions? Can you think ethically? Can you reach an ethical decision, judgment, and go on to act ethically? So acting in the world enabled by those two concepts in blue. But acting in the world is red because it's the apex of a triangle of meaning-making competencies, where the others are understanding the world and appreciating the world. So understanding the world, in particular, recognizing the proliferation of worldviews around us. As you saw from my list of jurisdictions, there they are, Australia, British Columbia in Canada, with the indigenous convictions of many of those citizens built into their countries. But right alongside the pre-modern proposition, the modern, the postmodern, and no doubt people who would admit to none of those beliefs at all. So what is it to understand all of those views and reconcile them and draw on each of them systematically for real issues in our world? And appreciating the world is a lot to do with awe-inspired enchantment, recognizing beauty, not just some Renaissance painting, but also You know, the beauty of a sunset as you walk home after rain. What does it mean? How do you reframe who you are, how you think and feel in the light of that experience? So we hope that those three reds together might help us to answer questions like, who am I, where am I, and what am I for? Two examples of the complexity that's gone into the design of each of these competencies. So this is the adaptive problem-solving one. You can see those rather cognitive pieces, skills, on the left-hand side in blue, be it, you know, identifying the problem, defining goals, exploring and testing different possible solutions. But so important, those character qualities, if I may call them that, on the right-hand side, self-regulated learning processes, the attitudes that feed up into them, and of course the domain knowledge. Similarly, though not so pretty on your chart, I did this one, here's understanding the world. So a reliance on critical and creative thinking, as Andreas mentioned, but empathy, curiosity and tolerance, and then the knowledge, the deep knowledge of global and intercultural issues. So these are competencies defined as a combination of knowledge, skills, both cognitive and non, attitudes and values, with character components infusing each and every one of them. And I think it's there that the magic lies. For those who fear that this all sounds great, but whatever happened to the things we've spent the last 30 or 40 years on, knowledge, maths, science and reading, here is the architecture that we put in place. At the top, you've got the human flourishing goals, happiness, relationship, meaning, accomplishment, with the competencies I've just been talking about in the middle. But the critical thing for this graphic is the foundation, because it all rests on the foundational literacies, maths, science and reading, social and emotional skills, the well-being factors. And the argument is that we're not saying the new is instead, but sits upon. You won't be an effective adaptive problem solver unless you bring a full and rich capability to think like a mathematician or a scientist, quite apart from the character skills I mentioned, that equip you in addressing those problems. So here's the architecture that reassures the more conservative small c jurisdictions, well represented in our 7 jurisdictions, that it's not away with the old, but rather how do we really build on the foundations to achieve something new and arguably critically relevant over the years ahead. And it's really that that's allowed different permanent secretaries, the Finnish and the British, to stand together and make these arguments under the banner of Education for Human Flourishing. Just a little on the system implications. In an earlier phase of this work, working with Jeff Masters, some of you may know him, he's the at least former director of ACER in Australia, in Melbourne. He helped us to a view of what the dimensions of a learning system, not an education system per se, but a learning system actually are. He saw outcomes of learning and equity and inclusion as the central goals. And we would say that those outcomes of learning are flourishing outcomes. And then he picked out the things you need to be good at system level if you're going to have a chance of equipping your young people with flourishing competencies. So our work has accepted all of those ideas, but it's evolved those ideas for a flourishing world. So in particular, we thought about highly effective teaching of flourishing competencies, and Singapore has helped us to a view of the learning environments we will need, 7 virtual and physical spaces, and the pedagogies that we will need. And they talk about a sort of equation of where old-fashioned instruction meets with experiential learning to enable active learning as the child pursues their passions, but systematically and rigorously. In the same way, we thought hard about ecosystems. Quite a lot of my work is actually in the global south with learning ecosystems, which could hardly be further away from your traditional school. Problem-solving circles in Medellin in Colombia with former guerrillas working with the kids on building a peace-building society. And the argument would be that if you want flourishing, you may well need to combine formal education with non-formal learning, where system meets ecosystem. So another example of how we've evolved the classical learning system to address the flourishing world. And finally, we've worked with Otto Scharmer at MIT, and the genesis of Theory U, you can see the U there on your screen, about what it takes not just to change a system, but to transform a system. And the proposition is that it takes a new kind of leader who is able, coming down the U on the left-hand side, to see and sense the world in a uniquely sensitive way. At the bottom, that idea of presencing, where presence meets sensing, and you figure out who you are and what your own capabilities and hopes are in the world. And then coming up the right-hand side, you begin to crystallize and to prototype and to put in place the new design, the new systems. And you can see there ideas of curiosity, compassion, and courage in the leader, which pick up some of those concepts of meaning and agency that I referred to in the learner. And in a way, tomorrow's leader will be today's learner. So there's a unity in these concepts. Well, perhaps that's enough. Just to say where we go next, because it's one thing to have a conceptual framework, but what difference does it make in the world? So the OECD will take a leadership role in all of this, for better or worse. I think for better. It'll do a couple of things itself. It will develop the assessments for the new competencies. And it may well be, as Roland said, that before very long they pick their way into the middle of the PISA framework. We'll see. The OECD will also coordinate policy dialogues with governments around the world to make sure that this really is shared and understood and valued. And probably through partnerships, it will do three other things. It will engage with audiences globally, be they teachers, young people, innovators, thought leaders. Here's a framework, but in a way, it will only come to life when people make their own worlds out of this high-level framework. The framework validates change, and no one much has been interested in significant change on this scale for many, many years. The OECD's role with these countries has been to say it's okay to think about something new, but what that is will differ by context. I think through partners, there will also be work on leadership development. How do policymakers, how do institutional leaders go about leading this kind of change? And finally, there'll be policy advice to governments that are interested in it, but particularly maybe to countries outside of the OECD sphere. The innovative younger countries, they were on Andreas's chart, the Perus, the Indias. They may not be there on the maths and science scores, but they are on the resilience and the innovative and the happiness. So to bring these ideas changed for culture and context back into the OECD conversation to shake things up will be important, I think. So that's what the next few years holds on the basis of this work. And it's vital to bring this work in a way home to you, because it does draw enormously on your inspiration and on thought leaders in this very group. And I think perhaps the right place to stop, if you think that we've at least done some justice to your thinking, is to thank you for your bravery, sometimes against the grain, in pushing some of these ideas. It feels like they might be starting to get some traction. Thank you very much.